Great, thank you so much. Thank you for everyone joining today to discuss this really important topic. Will clinical trials ever mirror real-world diversity? So I'd like to thank our panelists as well for joining. And before I let them introduce ourselves, just to give a bit more context to what we're going to talk about today. Just want to offer a few remarks on the criticality of this topic. And I think, there is an increased recognition of the importance of diverse representation of clinical trials, for the obvious benefit of ensuring medicines meet the needs of diverse populations. But then beyond that as well, it can enhance scientific generalizability and enable more efficient clinical trials operations. So yeah, I'm excited about about this conversation. But we all recognize that there is more work to be done, and there are significant gaps within clinical trials at the moment, such as within race, ethnicity, age, etc. So there is still a lot more to be done. So I'll hand it over to our panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll kick off the conversation.
Go ahead.
Later.
You start, Caridad, come on.
Well, I'm Caridad Pontes. I'm a physician by training and clinical pharmacologist specialist. And I've been working in pharmaceutical industry doing clinical trials for something like 15 years. And then in the hospital doing academic research, 5 years more. And then I went to the administration to do some management of healthcare. And in the background, I've been always collaborating with the Spanish Agency for Regulatory Affairs of pharma, basically pharma. So that's it.
You want to go next?
Where you want. Okay, I'll go. So I'm Antoine, investment director at Capricorn. So VC fund focusing on digital health and hardware and medtech. I'm a big believer of digital health solutions in real-world data, prevention, etc. So that's why I think I'm here in this panel. And may I already answer the question? I don't think it's possible ever, but let's discuss that later. So for me, it would be a no question. The answer on the question.
Last but not least, I hope, Pedro, founder of Biorce. We are a startup company in the clinical trial space, building technology to accelerate drug development as a whole. And obviously, probably taking Antoine's chance to answer the question as well. I think we also agree that I don't think it's definitely there today, and I think hopefully maybe in the future, but we are definitely a long way from that today.
Okay, and so I suppose going into that a bit further, Pedro, then, so where are we today, if you kind of want to set the context of how far are we away within clinical trials of representing diverse populations?
I mean, I'll definitely mention when we prepared this panel, I came with a lot of data points to the panelists, so probably why Ruth is sending it my way first. I mean, for disclosure, obviously at Biorce we host about 99+% of trials in worldwide since the year 2000, so we have a lot of data on this. And to start by saying that about 87% of studies in the past 24 years were run in what we call Western countries, so US and European countries. That alone skews data sets, and I don't think we need to go very much into details of what variables are skewed there, but that's definitely one side. There's definitely also a fact that until 1995, women were not allowed to join clinical trials, so that obviously skews data prior to that phase, which is now changing, even though there's still a certain disparity between what is the ratio of female to male participants in trials, but that's definitely getting better, although still not there yet. So I think there's definitely a lot of variables, maybe answering your question. I think those two data points are definitely very, very interesting and important to assess that it's not diverse today. But also to say that if we look beyond what is gender and what is location, if you look at the level of wealth, habits, nutritional habits that different societies and different cultures have, obviously have a large impact on how we live and how we live our lives overall. So that's definitely also retrospectively misguiding the data sets and literally the diversity of those trials.
Yeah, yeah. And moving to you, Caridad, so what do you see as kind of the biggest challenges that we have at the moment of addressing some of those issues that Pedro has pointed out?
Well, I think that in addition to the problem of obtaining a good demographic representativity of the data in clinical trials, we have also the challenge of the precision medicine. which is reducing and reducing and reducing the size of the studied population. So by the time we launch the products into the market, we really have very small data sets, which are enough for the products to be demonstrated that they are having a reasonable risk-benefit, but in terms of representativity of what can be later on, the target population that you are going to treat are very, very far away. Not only because of the demographic characteristics, which you already mentioned, but also the complexity of the clinical situation. So clinical situations in clinical trials, by definition, are tried to be kept as simple as possible because you have to reduce the noise to be able to detect the effect. And this is something structural, so it's very difficult that in time we may reach a way to represent the clinical complexity that is going to be the reality later on. It's very difficult to keep this in clinical trials.
Yeah, yeah. So it is difficult, but I suppose putting a positive light on it, what are we seeing that's working well at the moment? What are some of the things that we think that are improving diversity within clinical trials? Maybe Antoine, giving you a bird's eye view, being a VC.
Sorry, can you repeat your question?
So what are the positive things that we are seeing at the moment that can improve diversity within clinical trials? What are things that are working well?
You can tackle that question on different levels. Maybe firstly, also had some conversations with pharma companies. You also see more hybrid clinical trials where they're combining phase 3 and phase 4 studies at this moment. And I believe that's also very interesting because then you're immediately including the real world data into actually your phase 3 study. And this kind of gives some interesting already insights for these pharma companies, which now, let's be completely honest, a clinical study is still a very regulatory approval of is the medication working or not, and is it safe enough? Yes, okay, then we can launch it on the market. And maybe bluntly, I'm going to say it, and real world, we're going to see it afterwards when it's on the market, and then we're going to tackle that kind of problem. So that's, I believe, already a good progress forward. Personally, if I may say, I'm quite frustrated sometimes on clinical trials that is that rigid, so I feel like everybody's capturing here already real-world data. I think a lot of people, let's say maybe in the room, 60-70% is wearing a wearable. This is the type of data which should be included in clinical trials. I know it's not a primary or a secondary clinical endpoint, but it's that type of data which is already so useful maybe from the phase 1 study, and they should include that already into their clinical trial process. But since it's not required by the regulatory bodies, let's call it that way, and also since it's already quite costly, very costly a clinical trial, there is no incentive to do so. So yeah, I see it more and more happening, especially in the phase 4 studies, but my hope is that it also will actually slowly enters into the phase 2, phase 3 studies at this moment.
Yeah, and Caridad, Antoine was touching there on, the regulatory bodies aren't requiring wearables to be used in clinical trials and more kind of innovative approaches with clinical trials. What's your stance on that and the inclusion of, I suppose, novel technologies within clinical trials?
Well, I think that this is a huge opportunity and something that has to be uptaken. Obviously, we should try to keep, which is the focus of the clinical trials for regulatory purpose. So it's just demonstrating if the product is having the effect or not. But probably there is a second step that has been shifting more and more in the last decade, which is that of the access, that is focused more on the value, the added value that the products are bringing, rather than if the product is acting or not. And for access, you need another kind of information, much broader information that is allowing you to measure which is the actual value. And in this sense, all the patient-informed data and all the patient-collected data is of key importance because it's the one that, at the end of the day, allows you to know which is the relevance of what you have already demonstrated in scientific terms, if you want. So you're having an effect, but what does it mean? And to complement what does it mean, all this information that we are able to capture now that we weren't able to capture before is very, very valuable. So I think that it will come probably more into to answer this part of the question.
If I may add, it's not just capturing data and just generating huge data sets, etc. It's going to be key to capture the right data, because there is massive amounts of data, and you know, you have then those data lakes which actually you cannot be used by regulatory bodies or by pharma companies. So I think that will also be a challenge for the next years, where it's really to capture the right data into the right clinical studies of capturing the right real world data, let's call it that way, into those clinical studies.
Makes sense. And I'd like to get your stance on this. You're at the coalface building a company within this space, and you're trying to, you know, juggle so many different elements. So yeah, how are you approaching this problem with the business that you're building?
I mean, maybe just commenting something from earlier, I think the regulatory authorities obviously today use clinical trials to, I guess, get the sense whether it's safe and if it has an impact, to get the approval ultimately, as Caridad was saying. I think we need to start seeing trials going beyond that, and also assessing whether it's actually having a positive impact in the human's life overall. And I think if you look at, for example, GLP-1, using that example specifically on obesity, okay, the patient lost weight, that's the main metric we're trying to assess here, but what else happened to the lifestyle of the patient, you know? Are we actually increasing the quality of life that this patient is having overall? And obviously, I think that the problem we have here is that we humans, especially when it comes on to a for-profit industry, focus a lot on what are the mandatory requirements to get to X. And sometimes we also need to think what goes beyond the mandatory requirements, and what should we, as companies, and obviously as pharma and other products out there that need to go to these regulations, go through to get to that level. So that's maybe just addressing the point from earlier that I wanted to touch on. How are we addressing this? I think, you know, overall, if you look back into the past 24 years, we see a very much larger number of trials being run every year. Obviously, I don't know if you guys saw that data set, but in the past year, for the first time, we haven't increased the double digits trials overall in Europe. Only 2 countries actually had a positive increase, which was Portugal and Spain, which is definitely telling in one hand. On the other hand, we see China being number 2 for the first time into number of trials worldwide. So that's definitely also, I guess, helping on its own, that the world is evolving and other countries are having the power to run studies. As Biorce, so as a company ourselves, we focus a lot on building better protocols from the very beginning. So helping companies avoiding making the mistakes that they might not know even that they will make. And part of that is looking at those historical trials and learning from them to be able to get that level of insights that others did and that we don't tend to be as good at as an industry to share with each other our learnings. I guess we are not an open source type of industry, definitely not in the pharmaceutical space. And that's part of our job, to try to get that data and those insights to help companies making better decisions. And again, on that point, adding, you asked the question there, so sorry, it's a three-point answer. I think one last point on what else you said, that you asked what was working, and I think for once in the past few years we've seen the FDA requiring a diversity plan for trials, which is definitely helping and is a step in the right direction, even though it's a very focused American diversity in trials in the US. I still think it's one step forward instead of nothing, although obviously a long way to go again into a full diversity piece.
And are you seeing that within other regulatory areas as well, like the EU, and are they kind of following suit with the FDA, or?
I guess the controversial comment is that we always follow the FDA on whatever they say, but I guess indeed we are starting to go there. Obviously, we have a very different demographic to the US, so we also need to take that at face value. But I think we are getting there. Again, I think the FDA's first step, I guess, again, probably the plea from my side is that we need to ask the industry to go beyond what is the requirements.
Okay. And so I think a bit more future gazing. So you both said no at the start. We don't think that clinical trials will represent populations in the future. So what do we think it will look like? What does the future look like within this space, and what can we do to make it more diverse? Crystal ball gazing VC down here at the end. Go to you first.
It's It's a very difficult question, of course. You know, I'm a big believer, I think already knows, of including real-world data into clinical trials. That's for me for sure. But one of the main challenges, which I still find very struggling, is adherence to medication. How are we going to mirror that in the clinical, in the clinical studies compared to the real-world studies? Because we know, for example, chronic patients, on average, in the real world, 40% stops using their medication after a while. And this is completely not the case in clinical trials where it's 98% adherence rate. So there, I don't know how to answer your question, to be transparent, because I don't know how can we reflect that, because it's going to be key that to know exactly, okay, what will be the adherence rate to the medication? Should we change the clinical trial? Or maybe personally, I believe we should change the real world on that side, that the adherence rate is much bigger due to digital solutions, and due to that, thanks, we can mirror that clinical trial data compared to that real world data. So that's maybe on another way how I would tackle the diversity in the data. Of course, just like we mentioned already, diversity in gender, I think that should just be maybe a standard requirements into those kind of clinical studies, and also in different kind of countries. But I'm less experienced on that side, to be honest, because I'm more on the real world side. I don't want to have real world in the clinical studies, so maybe you have a better answer on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the opportunities that we are now starting to take advantage of is the availability of the data. That allows you, after the clinical trials and after the access moments, to try to check what is actually the product delivering when put into the clinics. So having the means to be following outcomes in real life, not just real world data, just real life. Does this investment that the healthcare system is doing, is it delivering health in real life? And the availability of the data allows you to start tracking certain products, not many of them, because we are still very much with a mindset of doing studies, so having a protocol and checking this variable and so. But I think that exploring the data on a timely basis, real-time information on the outcomes that the patients are having when using or after they are prescribed something, because adherence is a huge subject.
Yeah.
And you can predict if someone is going to be adherent or not, and you can predict how to better help a person to be adherent, but maybe they are getting good results precisely because they are not very much adherent. I mean, because we have patients that are very complex in the real life, that are having 10 medications, 12 medications. These people is not in the clinical trials. So maybe you are insisting on them to be very adherent, and maybe you are getting worse results if they are taking everything. So I think that having this data at hand allows you to identify which are at risk, who are not at risk, who are having better results after a prescription, who are having worse results after prescription, and so on. So I think this shift, no, from regulatory authorization to access and now to implementation in real life, I think this shift is also very interesting and a huge opportunity. Yeah.
Well, last but again not least, I hope. I think maybe stargazing, I'll avoid that for now, but trying to keep it real, let's say in 5-year, 10-year time window is probably easier, because otherwise we're going to sci-fi where we no longer need to do testing and trials overall. But let's talk about real life. I think on one hand, we definitely have the means today to monitor patients 24/7, and I think we'll get much better at that. Obviously, we need to be very cautious not to cross the full George Orwell type of real-life story where we are now measuring everything in people's lives. I think we need to keep it in a very scientific and clinically driven decision-making. But in a world where we can measure how the adherence is being done, how patients are relating to the medication as well, again, impact on habits overall on their life, and in a 24/7 type window where we are also measuring things like sleep. I mean, I think it's the 3 pillars for health, no? Sleep, food, and overall exercise. And I think those are the 3 things that we are not really even taking into consideration today in trials, you know? So if we don't go down that path, then eventually what is the point of trying to assess just if a GLP-1 is achieving a 21% in weight reduction, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, you're out.
no, it's gone.
Anyway, I don't think you can hear.
No.
It's okay.
No. Okay. All right. Well, we have a couple of minutes left, so if there's any audience questions, happy to open up the floor to any.
It's even hard to see.
No? Oh, here we go.
We can
Now you
hear
know
you.
how I
otherwise-
feel.
No, you can hear me. Okay, now it's working. Okay, thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting. Of course, as a medical doctor, I face this problem of picking the correct sample to do a study. And what are the easiest way to decide how to filter a sample of patients to do a clinical trial in primary care, for instance? Is there any secret strategy that you could bring up?
Well, I guess it depends on which is your question, and the scientific question, I mean, and which is the purpose of the trial.
In general, for chronic illnesses like hypertension or diabetes, you want to have a sample that is really realistic according to the big sample of the real life patients. So how do you get to the patients? Because normally you end up with the patients that are closer to you or more keen to participate, and that is already a bias of selection, and it's a big problem. How can we overcome and reach the general population to promote the study or the research you want to do and get participants from the big pool of patients?
Yeah, I guess the magic solution is randomizing through the electronic health records, and that's theoretically feasible. That would be the best way to approach a sample that is really representative all across the geography and all across but the reality is that implementing this is probably very complex because you have to have all the people involved in the trial that are trained and that are part of an investigative research, no? And good clinical practice is in between. And this makes a practical problem that is probably limiting in a way to go this way. But the theory is there, and I think we have some examples in Catalonia of some trials that were done in primary care using the electronic health record as a means to not only collect the information but also to randomize the patients with antibiotics in primary care for acute diseases. And the people in CDAP and Jordi Gold, they are trying to use the data this way. It's an interesting way to go, but it's just in the opposite way than everyone is going. I mean, the pharma is going to smaller and smaller, more high-tech patient, but the needs are in primary care, actually. Yeah, it's an interesting question, thanks.
If I may maybe add something there. At Biorce, obviously, we are not trying to solve that problem specifically, but we ended up doing something about it. We developed a model that matches EHR records with actual protocols, and we give it for free to hospitals. So we are really not trying to make this a business out of it. We are actually trying to solve patient recruitment as a target for free to the better of the world, because without that, we cannot have faster trials in the first place, and we cannot have better trials anyway. We are currently doing 2 live tests with about 4.5 million patients, and we see the results already much better, because that way we have a better sample of what the patients look like before you even design the protocol. Because again, back to the protocol designing piece, if I don't know how patients look like in terms of a population side, it's very hard to make a better protocol, right? And that's why we ended up going down that path, and again, giving it for free to hospitals to deploy and make the most out of it. And again, hopefully also making not only the trial faster, but the physician's job faster and easier too. So.
Cool. We have 40 seconds for one more question if there's anything. No? All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank all of you. Thank you very much, Caridad, Antoine, Pedro, and Ruth, our moderator. And excellent, you stuck to the time, so that's wonderful. Okay, so we're moving on now, and we're going to shift gears, and we're going to dive into another